The Trump administration's Argentina beef deal isn't a trade triumph. It's a lifeline thrown across oceans, while American pastures run dry. On paper, the plan sounds noble: flood the market with cheaper Argentine beef to ease record grocery bills. But behind that promise lies a quiet rupture. U.S. cattle herds are at their lowest in 70 years. Feed costs are soaring. And while Washington pledges $40 billion to stabilize Buenos Aires, families from Nebraska to Montana are selling off herds built over generations. Economists admit the truth: even doubling Argentine imports would barely move retail prices. Yet for producers here, futures markets dip, overnight banks freeze credit, and auction barns fill with disbelief. What was meant to bring relief abroad is breeding despair at home. Tonight we'll travel to 5 ranches once thriving, now standing on the edge of silence. Stay till the end. This isn't the end of hardship, it's where it begins. One Hall Ranch Angus. Hall Ranch Angus, just outside Bassett, sold everything this October: cows, calves, equipment, and with them the sound of a ranch at work. The pens are empty now. Dust drifts where cattle once stood shoulder to shoulder. For most shoppers, it's just another headline about beef prices and trade deals. But for the people who raise those animals, it's the end of a lifetime and the beginning of someone else's discount. Across the country, the U.S. cattle herd has dropped to its smallest size in nearly 70 years, about 86 million head. At the same time, store prices remain at record highs. The disconnect is cruel. Consumers feel squeezed and producers are squeezed harder. Fuel, feed, and freight all cost more. Tractor parts take weeks to arrive. Veterinarian visits doubled in price. Bank loans carry heavier interest. Since 2023, many ranches have watched their feed bills climb by more than 30%, while drought burned away grass, forcing them to buy hay and corn at premium rates just to keep animals fed. So when the administration announced plans to expand low-tariff imports of Argentine beef, it sounded, at least in Washington, like a quick way to cool prices at the meat counter. The problem is, it's not enough to matter. Argentine shipments make up only a small share of U.S. beef imports. Even doubling them would barely move the retail needle. And while customers might save a few dollars, the real cost would shift backward onto families like the Halls, who have already been living on thinner and thinner margins. For Hall Ranch Angus, that shift felt personal. Their pastures had thinned early in the summer. Each bale of hay cost more than twice what it did 5 years ago. The family borrowed against equipment to buy feed through August, betting that fall prices might rise. They didn't. Then came the news from Washington. More imports, lower tariffs, talk of stabilizing the market. To the Halls, it meant only one thing: next year's calf prices would probably drop while their bills stayed the same. The decision to sell wasn't emotional. It was arithmetic: feed costs up, interest up, market confidence down. One notice from the bank mentioned tighter credit coverage. Another from the feed supplier requested earlier payment. Each by itself was manageable. Together they made holding the herd impossible. "It's not about politics," one of the brothers said quietly on sale day. "It's about math and time." Meanwhile, biosecurity concerns kept adding weight to the ledger. Ranchers in the plains still talk about historic outbreaks of foot and mouth disease, and they've been watching reports of screwworms creeping north from Mexico. Regulators say protocols are in place, and audits confirm that. But ranchers know that one mistake, a single infected shipment, can close borders, spook buyers, and crash prices overnight. For a family already standing on a narrow margin, that's a risk too large to ignore. So they chose to step back, not in protest, not in defeat, in realism. The irony is sharp. The plan to make beef cheaper for American families will, at least for a while, work. Shelves will be stocked, and prices might tick down a few cents. But those savings are temporary, and they come from somewhere. They come from the families who built the domestic supply chain, from the people whose names are printed on cattle tags and brand registries, not on policy memos. There are better ways to help both sides, ways that keep the food supply stable without cutting out the people who grow it. Country of origin labeling would let shoppers see where their beef comes from and choose for themselves. A fully funded screwworm control program along the Texas border would address disease threats before they arrive. Drought insurance that reflects forage loss, not just calendar dates, would protect producers who live at the mercy of weather patterns that no longer behave. Because food security isn't just about price. It's about who's still left to raise the food when the price war ends. At Hall Ranch, dispersal day passed like clockwork. Papers signed, brands inspected, tags checked against records. Trucks lined up one after another. Buyers came from 3 states away. There was no ceremony, no bitterness, just the routine efficiency of people doing what they've done all their lives. By sundown, the cattle were gone, and the family stood by the fence in the quiet that follows noise. That silence says more than any policy speech ever could. To Churchill Cattle Company. They called it a world-class dispersal. To Jim Churchill, it was the sound of a note coming due. On paper, the sale looked like a success record bids clean paperwork, professional photos of fine Angus bulls. But under the bright lights of the sale barn, it felt like surrender. What the catalog didn't show was the family's kitchen table that morning covered in statements, reminders, and a yellow slip from the bank marked review needed. Churchill Cattle Company had survived blizzards, drought, and volatile markets for 3 generations. What finally broke it wasn't weather or disease, but money that simply stopped stretching. Feed had doubled in 2 years. Insurance premiums rose. The bank adjusted the ranch's credit line 3 times before calling for additional collateral. Meanwhile, news out of Washington promised a $40 billion bailout for Argentina and expanded beef imports to stabilize prices. To ranchers like Jim, that headline landed like gravel in an empty feed trough. Stabilize who he asked not to any reporter but to his wife as they folded the notice from the loan officer. Because it sure isn't us. Montana's cattle numbers have fallen nearly 10% since 2021. Some ranchers sold early because drought cut their hay crop in half. Others because their lender said no more carryover. Interest on operating loans has climbed 14% since 2022. The government can debate inflation in committee rooms, but on the range, it looks simpler, more cost-less cow. Every feed truck arrival adds another layer to the ledger, and when markets dip for even a week, anxiety fills the silence after dinner. Jim Churchill kept the books himself. Each month, the column labeled "Bank" grew heavier. Each trip to town for parts or mineral blocks felt like a negotiation with time. Meanwhile, on television, analysts discussed the Treasury's effort to convince Wall Street to underwrite a $20 billion package for Argentina's recovery. By contrast, rural credit here was shrinking. Local lenders, cautious from a decade of AG volatility, tightened requirements and raised interest. "We're not cutting you off," the banker told him. "We just need to be careful." Careful, a word that meant the difference between staying open and selling out. Still, Jim tried to hold. He delayed replacing a tractor tire. He skipped a planned fence repair. His wife began keeping receipts in a shoebox instead of a folder because the folder was already full. One neighbor hauled feed on credit and didn't charge for labor. Another offered to buy a few replacement heifers early just to put cash on the books. That's how rural communities carry each other when policy turns its back one small favor at a time. Yet there are limits to grace. By midsummer, the interest clock was louder than the cicadas. The next operating note came due, and the appraiser's letter followed. The property wasn't underwater, but the margin was too thin. The bank wanted more collateral equipment or additional land. Jim laughed, once the kind of dry laugh that ends with silence. "They've got all they're getting," he said. "I'm not signing the mountain too." At the same moment, headlines framed Argentina as a partner in mutual recovery. Big banks hesitated to lend. Washington encouraged them. For ranchers here, that comparison stung. Billions in guaranteed risk abroad. Zero tolerance for risk at home. The logic might be defensible on a balance sheet, but not in a family's life. On the ground, it meant selling animals with bloodlines perfected over 30 years just to clear interest. It meant explaining to the feed supplier that payment would be late, but not forgotten. It meant a son home from college asking whether to bother coming back next season. "We'll see," was all Jim could say. When the sale finally came, the yard filled early. Buyers from across the region came for genetics, not condolences. The auctioneer's cadence carried through the rafters, prices good mood quiet. Jim nodded to faces he knew, but avoided eye contact too long. Each sold lot felt like a page torn from a family record. Still, he shook hands with the buyers and thanked them. There's a kind of dignity in meeting obligations cleanly, even when it hurts. When Jim walked back into the house, the kitchen table was clear for the first time in months. The papers were filed, the debt retired, and the ranch, at least in name, was solvent. But the air felt thinner. "I guess we're free," his wife said softly. He nodded, not sure what freedom meant now. Afterward, the headlines kept rolling: beef imports, trade adjustments, export forecasts. None mentioned the Churchills or anyone like them. For them, economic recovery elsewhere translated into personal retreat. Here's the quiet truth this segment carries: every financial headline hides a household ledger. Every policy adjustment writes itself into somebody's soil. The nation may chase stability abroad, but the cost is often counted in places like Montana, in barns that empty too soon. While banks weigh risk in skyscrapers, families here measure it in miles to town. 3 Corman Cementals in Semangus. By early spring, Corman Cementals and Semangus in Mankato, Kansas, joined the growing list of dispersals. No fire, no flood, just another ranch folding under a market that moved faster than the grass could recover. The catalog was brief, complete, and final dispersal. April 9th, 2025, 30 years of breeding feed records and genetic notes sold line by line. What looked like a tidy auction sheet was in reality a reaction to a single ripple that began hundreds of miles away in Washington. Kansas had already seen dispersal listings rise by 30% in the first quarter of the year. Feed costs were up more than 30% since 2023. Live cattle futures had dropped 8% within days of the administration's announcement to expand low-tariff access for Argentine beef. On paper, it was a small trade adjustment. In practice, it shook confidence in the entire Midwest market. It's not the policy itself, said one livestock economist at Kansas State. It's the timing. Markets read headlines, not intentions. The government's reasoning was clear enough. Food inflation had become political oxygen too visible to ignore. Beef, in particular, carried symbolic weight. Prices at the grocery counter had risen faster than wages, and election season was drawing close. So the White House pushed for a short-term cooling measure, ease restrictions, let Argentine beef flow signal relief to households struggling with checkout totals. It was by most technical measures a strategic decision, fast, headline-friendly, and relatively safe compared with deeper reforms. But policy speed doesn't match pasture speed. Corman Cementals had no quarrel with Argentina or even trade. What broke them was the sudden shift in sentiment. Buyers hesitated. Feedlots delayed contracts. Future screens flashed red, and lenders paused new credit approvals, waiting to see where prices would settle. The effect spread like dry grass catching spark. In effect, the government achieved what it wanted: the optics of action. But the reaction carried farther than expected. While federal agencies issued memos about market integrity and fairness, the math at the ranch level no longer penciled out. I used to think in years, said one rancher near Corman's operation. Now I think in weeks, maybe days. At the same time, Washington did not stand idle. The USDA offered low-interest emergency loans and feed cost offset grants in select drought counties. They were pilot programs to support small processors and restore competition in regional meat packing. A few congressional voices, even within the president's party, asked for reviews of the import expansion. These gestures mattered, but they arrived slower than the bills on a rancher's desk. Meanwhile, Corman's numbers were relentless. Feed inputs had doubled, freight costs were up, and replacement heifers had become luxury assets. As one economist put it, margins in the cattle sector are thin enough that policy news can erase a month's profit in a day. So when the futures market slipped, the phone calls started. A feed supplier wanted partial payment up front. A buyer postponed delivery. The bank asked for updated projections. And just like that, a sustainable operation turned fragile. There's a strange irony in it. The policy was meant to defend consumer affordability, and it did in small ways. Average retail beef prices ticked down a few cents by late April. The national index steadied. Politicians could point to movement. Yet for families like the Cormans, those cents translated into hundreds of lost dollars per head. It wasn't sabotage. It was a collision between urgency and reality. At dawn, the week before their sale, the ranch looked unchanged. Calves bawled from the pens. The frost steamed off the water troughs. But inside the office, the conversation had already shifted from planning to liquidation. "We've got to be practical," said the owner, flipping through a ledger with notes in the margins. "I don't blame anyone. I just can't keep playing catch-up." Policy experts call this lag friction the gap between economic intent and operational impact. It's the moment when the government has already declared stability, but the producer hasn't yet felt it. And in that gap, trust quietly drains out of the system. Still, the administration wasn't wrong to act. Consumer costs had spiked more than 10% in 2 years. Pressure to ease grocery bills came from all sides: media, voters, trade groups, and budget offices. The Argentina move also carried diplomatic weight. Supporting Buenos Aires signaled a commitment to regional cooperation after years of strained relations. There was logic behind it. But logic doesn't pay for hay. In practical terms, said another Ag policy advisor, the government chose the shorter road, the one with faster optics but slower recovery for producers. Corman's auction drew strong attendance. Buyers came from Oklahoma, Texas, and Missouri chasing bloodlines they'd admired for years. Prices were decent, not desperate, but every bid felt like a farewell. After the final gavel, the rancher thanked the crowd. "This isn't about politics," he said quietly. "It's about math." The following week, Washington issued another release reaffirming support for domestic beef producers. It promised more review, more coordination, and long-term investment. But by then, the Corman's pens were already empty. Finally, the irony settles like dust. After a sale, one side of the system chasing cheaper beef, the other chasing solvency. No villains, just velocity policy moving faster than people can adjust. Markets eventually will self-correct. They always do, but people can't wait that long. Washington wanted calm at the checkout. Kansas paid for it in silence. For Lazy T Ranch, what happens when the math finally stops working? For the Lazy T Ranch, just outside Dalhart, Texas, the answer came quietly. Not in a storm or a market crash, but in a folder marked loan review. 65 years of steady work ended this summer, not from drought or disease, but from debt that grew faster than the herd. The numbers looked harmless at first. Interest on the operating loan crept from 6 to 9%. Feed climbed 28% in 2 years. Insurance doubled after a hailstorm the family barely survived. At the same time, futures wobbled as imported Argentine beef entered the pipeline and banks across the plains tightened agricultural credit. The federal funds rate stayed at 5.25%, and local lenders passed every fraction of it through to borrowers. Meanwhile, Washington said stability was returning. Retail beef prices had leveled. Inflation headlines softened. But on the ground, that calm never reached the panhandle. Lazy T's books carried the opposite story: cash flow, thinning variable interest, resetting equipment repairs, deferred again. In parallel, banks changed tone. Where they once offered handshake renewals, they now wanted documentation forecasts appraisals. The couple that ran Lazy T Ben and Carla Turner had nothing to hide, only nothing left to pledge. Their note had floated for years on a promise of predictable feed prices and predictable rain. Both vanished. As a result, Ben said, "Every number on this page depends on weather, and Washington and I can't control either." Carla tried to keep optimism alive. She handled the accounts, calling the lender twice a month to ask about refinancing options. The answer never changed: rates are holding. Guidance from the board is cautious. Those words, guidance and cautious, replaced the trust that once bridged banker and rancher. Lazy T cut back where it could. The family sold 20 breeding cows, then the yearling steers. They patched fences instead of replacing them. Their teenage daughter hauled the last load of feed using a borrowed trailer because theirs had cracked a spring. Nights grew longer around the kitchen table, the light harsh over the checkbook. "If we can make it through harvest," Carla whispered one evening, "maybe next year will ease." Ben nodded, not wanting to say that next year's interest clock had already started ticking. The government did try to help. The USDA's Farm Service Agency expanded its emergency loan window, but by summer the backlog stretched 45 days. County officials processed claims as fast as they could. Relief wasn't denial, it was delay. And delay costs money. When the Turners asked about feed grants, they learned their county didn't qualify because rainfall totals on paper were 2 inches above drought designation. On the ground, the ponds were dry. By contrast, national policy discussions focused on consumer optimism. Economic advisors spoke of disinflation momentum, praising the administration's short-term balance between trade relief and domestic cost control. It wasn't malicious. It was math at altitude, the kind that loses detail the higher it flies. Ben's banker was kind but clinical. "You've managed well," he said, sliding the file across the desk. "But your variable rate exposure is high. We can restructure, but you'll need to liquidate some assets." Ben signed before the sentence ended. "Which ones?" he asked. The reply came soft: "Start with the cattle." That afternoon, the ranch truck idled beside the pens for a long time. There was no drama, no shouting. Just the steady rhythm of gates and boots and the sound of animals being loaded, each one another line erased from the balance sheet. By July, Lazy T's dispersal was complete. Partial liquidation, they called it, not bankruptcy, not closure. Still, the result felt the same. Carla closed the ledger, typed finalized on the spreadsheet, and printed one clean copy for the accountant. The paper rustled like dry grass. In the end, the policy machine kept turning. Inflation reports improved. The consumer confidence index ticked up. Yet in towns like Dalhart, feed suppliers consolidated, small haulers quit, and the empty barn stood as evidence that stability on paper doesn't always translate to survival on land. Ben now works part-time hauling grain for another outfit. Carla does bookkeeping for 3 neighboring ranches. They still drive past the Lazy T sign each morning, still mow around it. "We didn't fail," she says. "We just ran out of time." There's no outrage in her voice, only exhaustion shaped into realism. When asked if she blames the government, she shakes her head. They're trying to fix things for everyone, she says. But the system counts cows. It doesn't count hours. That is the quiet lesson buried inside the spreadsheets and statements. Credit can extend opportunity, but it can also measure when that opportunity ends. The ledger balanced. The pasture didn't. 5 McAllister Ranch. From the highway, Carbon County still looks whole green hills rolling into distance, wind turbines turning slow fences straight and proud. The landscape keeps its composure. But if you pull over, switch off the truck, and just listen, you'll notice what's missing. The low hum of feed trucks, the clatter from the mill, the voices that used to rise before dawn, all of it has thinned. In August 2025, McAllister Ranch, the county's largest private employer, shut down its feed operation. No press conference, no banners. Just a short notice taped to the co-op door closed until further notice. To outsiders, it sounded temporary. To locals, it read like an obituary. For more than 40 years, McAllister supplied premium feed cattle to regional buyers. It kept 15 families on payroll and supported dozens more welders, truckers, veterinarians, and mechanics. When the ranch stopped shipping, the ripple hit fast. The feed store on Main Street cut hours. The school bus changed its route because 2 families had moved away. At the diner, the waitress switched from, "How are your calves doing?" to "You still here." What caused the shutdown wasn't scandal or neglect. It was arithmetic. Since the government expanded low-tariff access for Argentine beef procurement chains, have shifted in ways few predicted. Major packers, the top 4, which control roughly 85% of U.S. beef processing, adjusted sourcing contracts to hedge risk. Cheaper imports meant they could push domestic bids lower while maintaining supply. Feedlots in turn tightened margins and delayed purchase schedules. For a ranch like McAllister, the shift was subtle at first, just smaller orders, slower payments, one buyer less reliable than before. But when prices dipped 8% and fuel jumped 25%, the math fell apart. "They say the market will balance," said the county commissioner herself, a rancher's daughter. But markets don't balance people, they balance numbers. At the same time, interest rates held steady near 9% for operating loans. Insurance premiums rose again. Transportation costs, already high in Wyoming's wide emptiness, climbed further as small haulers left the business. By then, McAllister was carrying more cost per head than it could recoup at sale. The choice came down to selling cattle or losing land. They chose cattle. In turn, the county lost more than livestock. It lost rhythm. The high school's agriculture program, once funded by ranch donations, went dormant. The annual fair scaled back. Even the volunteer fire department felt that one of its trucks had been serviced for free at the ranch shop each spring. When that stopped, they started a fundraiser just to buy oil and filters. Local economist Sarah Klein from the University of Wyoming explained the pattern bluntly. Once consolidation takes hold, it's not the markets that disappear, it's the middle ground. And that's what rural counties are built on, the middle. Still, McAllister's story isn't one of anger. It's weariness. The family didn't point fingers at Argentina, or at Washington, or even at the Packers. "You can't run cattle on resentment," said Tom McAllister, standing beside an empty feed bunk. "We had a good run. But you reach a point where you're working just to feed the system, not your own land." By autumn, the local feed yard where McAllister once delivered had shuttered too. Trucks that used to line up along the rail spur now park at the grain elevator, hauling freight for other industries. Some ranch hands moved south to Colorado for construction jobs. One stayed on to help maintain fences for hunters leasing the land. The rest packed their tools into pickup beds and left before the first snow. Still, not everything faded. In late September, a handful of ranchers and townspeople met in the school cafeteria. Same linoleum floors, same fluorescent buzz to talk about buying a portion of McAllister's land as a cooperative venture. They weren't idealists. They were accountants, teachers, and retired hands pooling what savings they could. Maybe we can't bring back the yard, one said, but we can keep the ground local. It was a small sentence almost lost under the hum of the vending machine, but it landed like a seed. Eventually, even the commissioner called the meeting a turning point, or at least a pause in the decline. No one promised miracles. They just agreed to meet again next month. In the quiet that follows such meetings, you understand something that charts can't show. Economics measures production, but not belonging. Trade deals record tonnage, not trust. When one ranch folds, it's not just cattle leaving. It's knowledge, it's continuity. It's the ordinary glue that holds small towns together. Today, the McAllister barns sit locked, their red paint fading under the high plains sun. But near the mailbox, someone still mows the grass. The sign McAllister Ranch Est, 1983 remains upright. The hard part isn't over, it's only just begun. America's ranch lands are standing at a crossroads, caught between global trade and the ground beneath their boots. But this story isn't about defeat, it's about endurance. Every generation before has faced its own drought, its own market crash, its own moment when survival meant starting again from less. And every time they stayed. What's coming may test that same spirit once more with tighter margins, shifting policies, and the weight of decisions made far from the pasture. Yet resilience has always grown in silence, not headlines. Because as long as people still rise before dawn, fix fences in the wind, and carry the quiet pride of feeding a nation, there's nothing truly lost. The ground is still here. The work is still ours. And as long as we stand firm, so will the land.